Today's Blind Side is an archive of an interview everyday sexism campaigner Laura Bates gave to the ITV daytime talk show Loose Women as part of her promotional campaign for her book, The Men Who Hate Women. Originally broadcast on the 21st of September 2020, Bates describes how she went undercover, descending into the vast underworld sewage system of online misogyny, and has returned with an alarming thesis about some of the men who walk amongst us. I committed to the archive in advance of a new series that will examine the credibility of some of the quite extraordinary, albeit predictable, claims that she advances in her book.
It is every parent's nightmare, their child being groomed and radicalised online. Now, you might think you know the traditional signs to look out for, but according to author Laura Bates, there is a new form of terrorism on the rise. It's recruiting boys to hate and harm women, and many parents may be completely unaware of it. Laura joins us now. Welcome, Laura. Hello.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Well, Laura, you started the Everyday Sexism project back in 2012, and since that time, you managed to infiltrate, if that's the right word, an online group of men who basically their whole remit is to hate women, to harm women, to troll women, not just online, but in real life as well. And you've written a book called Men Who Hate Women. And you said you decided to write this book because you've known about these communities for years, but you wanted to sort of educate people that this is not just happening in far-flung places, in communities that we might not necessarily work with. This is happening now to all communities. This can affect all women.
Absolutely. These are communities which sound very extreme and many people have never even heard of them. But actually, the reality is that they are coming offline and having a real world impact. So these are men who believe in some cases, one group is called the incels or involuntary celibates. So they're men who believe that women owe them sex. And because they're not having sex, they blame all women. And they actively incite others in these communities to go offline to rape and murder women, which sounds completely extreme and like we must be talking about a tiny, tiny group with no offline influence. But the truth is that these men have repeatedly carried out these kinds of massacres. There was Elliot Rodger's massacre in America where 6 people were killed and 14 injured, or the Toronto van attack in Canada where Alec Manassian killed 10 people and injured 14 others, explicitly in the name of this ideology of hating women. But we don't call it terrorism, even though I've linked these ideologies and others connected ideologies to over 100 murders or serious injuries in the last 10 years alone. Wow. We're very used, I think, to seeing men killing women. We know that over 2 women a week, for example, are killed in the UK by a current or former partner. So we don't necessarily talk about this as a form of terrorism, even though it absolutely meets every international definition. But what really worried me was realizing that they were starting to have a major impact grooming and radicalizing young people with these ideas as well. And that's why I felt like it was important to start talking about this.
Well, Laura, can I first say congratulations on writing such a brave book, because really, I mean, it's very much needed. But also, when you talk about this community, what kind of numbers are we talking? And also, that we're not just talking about certain cultures. We're talking, this is men regardless of culture. We're talking black men, Asian men, white men.
Absolutely. In fact, we're talking predominantly educated white men, many of them young. These communities have a huge overlap, in fact, with white supremacy, with neo-Nazism and the alt-right. So there's a lot of racism bound up in all this. Wow. And in fact, they actively see this violent hatred of women as a recruiting tactic to involve young boys further in other terrorist and hate-fueled ideologies like white supremacy and the alt-right. So it's very much something that's universal. It's affecting all different kinds of men, but often white men. And the numbers are much bigger than you might realize, because it sounds like we're talking about something so extreme. We must be just talking about a handful. But actually, I've infiltrated and uncovered a network that is a vast network of platforms, blogs, groups, communities, forums, many of them individually with membership in the tens or hundreds of thousands, many of their videos having tens of millions of views. I would estimate that the global size of this community is certainly in the hundreds of thousands. But one of the experts I interviewed for the book said that even just within the UK, he would set it at around 10,000 people.
Wow. Wow. That's incredible.
So,
I mean, yeah, Laura, I mean, you know, we're all mums of sons on here, and it's quite terrifying when you say that these people are trying to get to young children through things like computer games and stuff, games like Fortnite. I mean, that's absolutely terrifying, especially because kids are very vulnerable, especially when they're teenagers. And I know that you actually went undercover and were at one point receiving maybe 200 death and rape threats a day. I mean, this is a much, much bigger thing than we ever anticipated. What advice would you give to mothers of children? Boys, what should we be looking out for?
absolutely, I completely agree. You know, boys are so vulnerable to this, and they are really preying on boys' particular fears and vulnerabilities in a world where boys don't necessarily have the opportunity to talk about these kinds of anxieties and issues offline. We've seen huge cuts, of course, to youth centre funding. And so boys are often being targeted online in places like bodybuilding websites and forums, or over gaming live streams. It might be through viral YouTube videos or Instagram memes. So the first thing I'd say is that parents can do so much just by familiarising themselves a little bit with the content of young people's online worlds. We're at this strange moment in history that we rarely talk about, where a generation of digital natives is being parented and educated by a generation of non-digital natives. And that actually is a huge gap in experience, but we don't often think about it. So having a look, I think, for parents at some of the bigger kind of men's rights, or red pill as they call them, communities on Reddit is a good place to start. Have a look at some of the viral videos about feminists being destroyed or feminism is cancer on YouTube. Even just have a look at some of the kind of racism and misogyny in some of the more popular Instagram meme accounts. And you start to understand how they're using these, and very deliberately using this kind of content that starts out as jokes, as a sort of slipway. They describe it themselves, these extremists, as adding cherry flavour to children's medicine. I wrote the book really to give an insight for people who don't know anything about these communities. So the book kind of outlines for parents some ideas of red flags that they can look out for, and particular areas where this kind of thing might be happening. But for me, I think also suggesting that schools are aware of this is a really productive thing parents can do. Schools are aware of other forms of radicalisation and extremism, and they are supported and funded to look out for those signs and to support young people who might be being groomed.
Laura, I've got a list of your tips here. Like you say, associate yourself with red flag words, investigate if your child's views suddenly change, help them stop fake news, and conversation and open communication. Laura, thank you so much for joining us today. Such an important book. Don't go anywhere.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.